Welcome. Today we're going to talk about the Porsche 964, a Porsche that I'm extremely excited to talk to you about because it's one that's near and dear to my heart. I've been passionate about these cars since they were brand new as a young teenage boy working at a Porsche dealership. So let's talk 964. Today I'm pretty excited. We have a wide array of 964s here. If you know you've been shopping for a 964, it's really hard to find one. So to be able to get an opportunity to have 5 of them together all in one place is a great opportunity.
Be sure to log into your YouTube account, subscribe to our channel, and turn on notifications so you don't miss a video. Best of all, it's free to do so.
So we're going to start, of course, with a Guards Red 964 Cabriolet. This would be an early car, a 1991. We'll touch a little bit on this car. We'll talk about one of the more rare variants. This would be a 964 Targa, also a 1991 in slate gray. Our major feature car today, the one I'm going to be really delving into, this is a 1994 C2 manual coupe. This is kind of the holy grail, very end of production in polar silver metallic. And I probably used the term Holy Grail just a little bit too soon because for many of us in the 964 faithful, this would be the one. This would be a 1994 964 3.6 liter turbo in Amazon green, which to most people's eyes looks blue. It's a gorgeous shade that changes color depending on the light. And then one of my personal favorites, in fact, on the PCA register for these cars, the RS America. This is one of the very last ones built. It's a 94. One of just 84 cars built in 1994. So with that, let's talk 964s. The first caveat I want to make, a couple of my videos, someone who knows a lot about the brand will point out to me, well, Nate, didn't you forget about this variant and that variant and this variant? What I'll say about 964s is they are the rarest generation of Porsche 911 ever built, and they built a ton of variants. So yes, I'm aware of the 3.3 turbo, and yes, I'm aware of the Carrera Cup and the Carrera RS, RSR 3.8, the Lichtbau, the package cars, all those cars. We're not going to cover all those in the video. They are great cars, but simply I couldn't gather all these, and I wanted this to be more of a mainstream video about the 964s. The majority of you are going to run into in your day. If you run across one of those rare variants, call me. I'd love to hear about it. So let's start talking about history of the 964, and then I'll step through changes over the years and what things were happening. So again, I'm going to use this car as just sort of a talking point, but the 964 debuted in 1989 and a half. Sounds kind of funny. And interestingly enough, they debuted it with just the Carrera 4 in the coupe format. The 964 Carrera 4 all-wheel drive system is very advanced. They used a lot of the things they learned from the 959 in that car, and it was the very first street, commonly street-sold Porsche with all-wheel drive. Of course, someone will point out to me the 959. I would not call that a commonly street-driven car. So the Carrera 4, one of the things about those cars that are sort of interesting is for a long time, a lot of people in the Porsche marketplace denigrated those cars because they felt that the system was too complex. I would argue the system is unbelievably complex, but it's unbelievably good. The technology that Porsche used at that time to put that system together is quite remarkable. Unfortunately, it was very expensive to put together, and actually for the 993, I would argue they took a step backwards and they went to a much simpler system using a viscous coupling. But the all-wheel drive system in the original Carrera 4 is a thing of engineering beauty. So 89s are kind of unique. They're the only US delivered cars that did not get airbags. They still had a single mass flywheel, so they don't get the dual mass flywheel. The reason the Porsche went to the dual mass flywheel is to kind of quell some driveline and transmission vibrations and rattles. So if you drive a single mass flywheel 964, you generally will hear a little bit more gear rattle and that sort of thing at idle. It's totally normal. So about 1,189 and a half cars were built. And unfortunately, those cars were ones that fell in value probably the fastest early on. As recently as 5 or 6 years ago, you could buy a Carrera 4 89 and a half car, not a particularly nice one, but for around $15,000. Those days are long gone. If you're very lucky, maybe you'll find someone who's been living under a rock, but the days of the $15,000 964 have well gone by the wayside. Starting in 1990, they introduced a bunch of the full variant models. So they brought in the Carrera 2. Again, pretty simple. It's rear-wheel drive, a more traditional layout for Porsche, in a coupe version. And just slightly after that, they introduced the Targa. The Targa they made all 4 years of production, but it's the rarest variant by a wide margin. Okay, so the Targa debuted in 1990, as did the Cabriolet. Interestingly enough, you could get any of these three variants in either Carrera 2 or Carrera 4. So the most expensive variant early on was the Carrera 4 Cabriolet, which I always thought was a little bit of an unusual configuration, the all-wheel drive convertible. But believe it or not, they actually sold fairly well early on. So again, three variants. They also introduced something that was new for Porsche the very first time. A true automatic transmission debuted in very early 1990 called the Tiptronic, and it was only available in the two-wheel drive cars. There was no such thing as a Carrera 4 Tiptronic or a turbo. Just the normally aspirated rear-wheel drive cars offer the Tiptronic. In the marketplace, the Tiptronic sells at a significant discount, so probably your best value entry point into the market would be, for example, a Tiptronic and then a Cabriolet. Because in terms of values in the market, if we just talk normally aspirated cars, C2 manual coupes would be the most valuable, followed by C4 manual coupes, very close behind Targas, with a C2 Targa doing better than a C4 Targa, and a C2 Cabriolet, C4 Cabriolet, and then really almost anything with the Tiptronic towards the bottom in kind of a similar order. Now, that's not me making a value judgment about what I think about those particular cars, so please don't send me feedback that I insulted your car. That's just speaking to how the market judges them in terms of a value. I always encourage people to buy the variant that works for you and speaks to you. So, like for me personally, I have an affinity for the 964 Targa. I really like this car because it's the last of the traditional styled Targa that Porsche introduced as early as 1966. So you can see this traditional Targa bar, traditional Targa roof. Starting with the 993, they went with more the double sunroof, double glass that carried through the 993, 996, and 997. And Porsche brought this back, or something very similar aesthetic look, starting with the 991, and it has sold very well for Porsche. So this tells you what people think of that particular configuration. In terms of the Cabriolets, probably the most common variant you'll find for sale on the market, not because they built more than coupes, they just tend to be more available than the coupes are. And again, they sell at a slight discount, and they're a great car. Mechanically, they're the same. You know, there's a lot of noise made about, you know, a coupe is more rigid, but ultimately for a weekend fun back road carver, I really don't think you can go wrong with one of those. Of course, we can't skip a couple rare variants that we have here, which would be the turbos. So the turbo skipped. We had a 930 turbo in 1989, and actually Porsche wasn't sure they were going to make a 964 turbo. They were working on a project called the 965 that got axed due to budgetary constraints. And so they kind of scrambled a little bit, and they decided, well, let's take a lot of things out of our 930 parts bin, update them a little bit, and put it in with the chassis updates of the 964. So one of the things about the 964 chassis is it was 85% new. So, and this holds true for any of these cars. So essentially, everything under the skin on a 964 changed, even though the basic car looked very similar to the outgoing 3.2 liter Carrera. They did that for a couple reasons. One, as frank as I can be, Porsche was not doing well financially, and they simply didn't have the budget to do a massive overhaul on the car. That was item one. And item two, they knew this shape and this look was sacrosanct, and they did not want to upset their customers. Funny enough, they didn't fully achieve that. One of the reasons 964s struggled in the market was the faithful felt that these new bumpers were a little bit ungainly. I think they couldn't have been farther from the truth, but the market didn't respond as well as Porsche wanted to this car. So that's actually one of the reasons that these cars are so hard to find now. Basically, it's a trifecta of factors. Number one, when they were new, the faithful kind of poo-pooed these cars a little bit because they struggled with some of the aesthetics. They struggled with the fact that they offered a Carrera 4. They thought that God intended a Porsche to be rear-wheel drive. The early cars had some mechanical teething problems, and we'll touch on what some of those are here later in the video. And then the other thing that was happening is The 964, believe it or not, was the most expensive 911 ever built, adjusted for inflation. So when these cars were new, they were extraordinarily expensive. So essentially, you take a car the faithful kind of struggle with some of the aesthetics, you had a few mechanical foibles, and you made them really expensive in a time the economy wasn't doing very well, and you have a perfect recipe for a low production automobile. So as the years wore on, they got more and more rare. So it's actually interesting that we have 3 1994s here. 1994 is the lowest production year for Porsche in the US in modern history, right? I mean, it was a terrible year for Porsche. So if you're looking at 964s, what you're going to find the most common years are 1990 and 1991. And that's really a factor of the fact that it was a new model. There were some people that were buying it. And the economy was just a little bit better in that era. 92 to 94, things were not doing so hot. And frankly, people said this car is so expensive, there's other competition out there that are better cars. They, of course, were wrong. But here we are in 2022, and the market has finally arrived on the 964. This happened probably 6 or 7 years ago. People really discovered. It's as if they got a new set of eyes and they said, wow, this car we've had this whole time is magically better or different than what it once was, which is kind of funny because it's still the same car it's always been. But I think there's a couple things at play. I think the number one thing is that people have really warmed up to this traditional upright fender of the 964. You know, the later 993, which is a gorgeous car, is the only air-cooled 911 to deviate from this traditional style fender. They've got the laid down fender, which is a pretty car, but it's not the traditional 911 aesthetic. And so I really think that's the number one thing. The 964, you get the updated modern coilover suspension, ABS brakes, a better HVAC system, dual plug 3.6 liter motor, but you have the traditional 911 aesthetic. I think that's a big driver. A lot of people talk about the fact that, you know, there's some companies out there building cars, Singer being one of the big ones, using the 964 as their platform, and they think that's driving their value. They also think that some of these companies have bought up all the 964s and that's driving their value. I think that's a too simplistic look at it. I really think that people have discovered that the 964 is kind of the Goldilocks. It's a much more modern feel than a 3.2 Carrera, but it's more raw and more traditional looking than a 993, and therefore I think it makes it a car that a lot of people get excited about. So with that, let's talk about some changes over the years. Generally, you can lump 964s into two categories, early cars and late cars, with the change being model year 1992. I want to touch on that a little bit because one of the things about that is that Porsche is an engineering company, and they were a small company at the time. And the thing to know is that when they came up with an engineering change, it often was phased in as soon as the change was approved and they had parts on the assembly line. So a lot of people will say, oh, well, that's from model year 1992 or model year 1993. But oftentimes those changes happen mid-year. So as a general category, I'll call them out by model year, but a lot of these don't fall hard and fast lines, okay? So let's talk a little bit about some of the very first visual clues, and we'll use this Targa as a good example. This is a 1991, but visually the early cars all share the same visual clues. So the one ways you know that you have an early car, they use this wheel called a Design 90. In 1989 and a half until 1991, there were only 2 wheel choices available for these cars. The first choice was the Design 90. Probably 95% of the cars have this wheel. It's a 16-inch wheel. You also get a forged wheel, also in 16-inch, which looks the same as the one offered on the 928. Very rarely seen, but was optional in these early cars. The other really good visual is the flag style mirror, which is the style mirror Porsche used starting in 1976. And this went out of production on the 964 in 1991, except on the Turbo. The Turbo always got the later Aero style mirror. So again, if you see a car and it's got the Design 90 wheels and a flag style mirror, you generally have a 1989 and a half until a 1991. So you say, well, how do I know it's not an 89 and a half? Well, if it's Targa or Cabriolet, we know it's not. So it has to be a coupe, it has to be a Carrera 4, and a really simple way is look inside if it has a non-airbag steering wheel. So the 89.5 cars had no airbags, so they used the same 4-spoke wheel that the 3.2-liter Carrera was using. The other giveaway on a Carrera 2 is they used the small single piston rear calipers. You can kind of see those in here on the C2. Those were updated starting in 1992. They got the larger 2-piston caliper. One advantage of C4 always got the bigger brakes. For whatever reason, the 2s got the smaller brakes in the early model, 1990 and 1991. Those are your biggest visual clues. There's some other engineering changes along the way. So let's talk about what some of those engineering changes are. The single biggest one that people want to talk about is head gaskets. So when these cars were introduced, Porsche's feeling was that the engineering tolerances allowed them to get away without using head gaskets. So the early cars through about May of 91, but again, there was just a moment in time where they put this change in effect. They did not use a head gasket. The later cars were machined and grooved and it used head gaskets. Generally speaking, the earlier cars had more issues with leaks. However, what I would tell people is if you have a 1990 pre-head gasket car and it's not leaking from the head gaskets, 22 years or 32 years later, it's not likely to start leaking. So don't lose sleep over that. The other thing is so many of the head gasket cars are leaking because they're now 32 years old. So I wouldn't get so caught up in that as sort of something to get spun up about. So let's jump over this 94 and then we'll just talk about some of these exterior changes, and you can see a couple big obvious ones. The single biggest one is wheel design. These are commonly called the Cup 1. These were optional on this car. They were standard on the turbo. The difference was the standard wheel went to what's called a Design 92, very creatively named because it was introduced in 1992. And it uses a very thin 5-spoke, so it's a similar design. Some people will call it a 16-inch Cup 1. That's not the correct term. The correct term is a Design 92. It was also used on the 968. But again, these are the Cup 1. These were optional. Not that many cars actually had these optioned. They were 7-inch in the front, 8-inch in the rear. The turbos used the same wheel design, but they used a 9-inch in the rear. Aero mirror. So the aero mirror debuted on the regular cars in 1992, but again, always came on the turbos. So those are some of the visual clues, by year, what year you're dealing with. As a general rule in the marketplace, the newer the 964, the higher the demand. So if you know nothing else about it, a 94 will generally bring more than a 1990. But again, what I would encourage people to do is buy the best car you absolutely can find. In 1992, they also introduced a couple other variants I do want to at least touch on. So we'll reference over to this Cabriolet. In 1992, they introduced a car called the America Roadster. The America Roadster is essentially a 964 Carrera 2 Cabriolet, but it got the turbo bodywork, suspension, and brakes. So it's going to have a wide body. It's going to have the turbo suspension and brakes, Cup 1 wheels, aero mirrors. One interesting thing about that car is it's the only variant where you could get a wide body 964 in rear wheel drive, or normally aspirated, I should say, because they did make one other special edition in 1994. Partly is because they had a bunch of unused turbo body shells they needed to get rid of. They built the final year 964 Carrera 4 Coupe, or what they call the turbo look. 280 some odd examples of those. They're in very high demand. Very, very cool car. And again, have the turbo body would be a car definitely worth owning. A couple other spotters changes that are unique to various models. Starting in 1992, all cabriolets got rear seat deletes. And that's simply because the federal government mandated a 3-point seat belt for the rear in cars. And Porsche, frankly, didn't have the budget to engineer a solution. And so they said, well, we'll just get rid of the rear seats. So if you have a 1992 to 1994 US delivered cabriolet, it will not have rear seats. It'll have a rear seat delete, kind of a cool thing. You'll notice in the 993, they finally came to a more integrated and designed 3-point seat belt for the cabriolet. So that's one of the big spotters got on a late cabriolet, aero mirrors, and a rear seat delete. Targas visually just had those changes through the variant. While we're talking about Targas, there's a lot of noise, no pun intended, about Targas and whether they're, how good are they compared to a cabriolet or a coupe. What I tell people is a good Targa is a beautiful thing. Not just aesthetically, functionally they're great. What I will tell you though is a bad Targa is a terrible thing. Usually what happens with Targas is they're very sensitive to the car being laser straight and never having had any accidents. That's one, because the tolerances are very tight. The other issue is this top is designed to fold, and what happens is the frames on the Targa tops fail or break, and they no longer fit well. And then some well-intentioned soul generally comes along and starts putting more seals on them, thinking that will solve the problem, and then the tops sit proud and make a lot of noise. So if you ever drive a 964 Targa, or frankly any early Targa, and you have significant wind noise here at this top header, that's actually not correct. A lot of people will say, oh, well, all Targas are like that. What I would say is many Targas are like that, but they didn't come new like that. So before you form a judgment about how Targas are, make sure you drive a good one. A good one, like had the opportunity to drive this car, is just drum tight. It's just a beautiful thing. And they're quite enjoyable with the top off in the summertime. I would encourage you never to fold the top, however. When I drive mine, I take the top off and I set it gently at home. It does restrict me a little bit if I'm going to travel, but I just would prefer not to break the top. So that's kind of worth knowing on 964 Targas. I'm a big fan. Since we talked about open roofs, we talked about Targa tops, let's talk about sunroofs, right? This is always a hot topic, and it'll relate to one of these other special models we have here, is that in the US, the sunroof was standard equipment. In today's market, there's a lot of demand for non-sunroof cars. You could delete the sunroof in the US. It was option code number 652, but pretty unusually rare. I've seen just a handful in all the years I've been doing this, with exception of a couple models. One, if you get a car that was delivered outside the US, sunroofs were still optional, so it's not that unusual, for example, to find a Japanese or a German delivered 964 with no sunroof. Or on this car, the car at the end, the RS America. So the RS America is an interesting car. I have a particular interest in these cars. I own a few of them. I've owned a bunch of them over the years. And the RS America was one of the ways that Porsche was attempting to rebuild sales because things were really struggling. By 1992, times were pretty unprecedentedly bad with Porsche. And so they said, well, how do we inspire some sales? In Europe, they got a car called the 964 RS, which is a spectacular car. There's always been this fight, is the RS America really an RS? Well, Porsche calls it an RS. Is it the same car as a 964 RS? Unequivocally, no, it is not. Is it still a very, very cool car with its own niche place in Porsche history? Absolutely. So what's different about an RS America versus a regular 964 C2? So basically what they did is, for the only time I can possibly think in Porsche history, they decontented the car, but they actually decreased the price. So these cost about $6,000 less than a regular 964 C2, and they got some cool equipment. So they got the MO30 sport suspension as standard equipment. They got the Cup 1 wheels as standard equipment. They got a pair of corduroy sport seats, which are really spectacular. You can zoom in and show you those. And then they deleted some items, like they deleted the power steering. They deleted the cruise control. They deleted the power mirrors. The visual is they deleted the rear power spoiler. So a traditional 964 has a speed actuated rear spoiler. The RS America went back to a style spoiler almost identical to a 3.2 Carrera, with one important distinction. It doesn't have a cutout for the rear wiper because they never offered that. They, of course, then were badged as RS America. Funny story about this badge is it's unobtainium because when they were new, Porsche supplied them to the owner with simply instructions for how to install them. And they said, if you'd like to install them, here's how you do it. And some people did, and many people didn't, and they got shoved in a drawer somewhere. And now if you have an RS America and you don't have the badge, they're not really available. So kind of a funny little thing. So in terms of performance, a lot of people, what they denigrated about these cars is they did not have any additional performance in the back versus a regular 964. The difference between this, for example, and a 964 RS, the European car, that car got thinner glass, lighter clutch and flywheel, different ratios in the transmission, a seam welded chassis, and they stripped it devoid of any of the insulation and soundproofing and that sort of thing, so it was a little bit lighter, and they got magnesium wheels. So that's a fabulous car. If you could have one of those, that's a great car, but it's nothing to take away from this car. They made 701 of these, and just 84 of them were 1994 model years, which is the only one that got a rear seat. So the 93s have the rear seat delete, 94s got the rear seat. I started talking about these because we started talking about sunroofs. If you want a non-sunroof 964, this is the easiest way or best way to get one. RS America's only had 4 options. The options were sunroof, air conditioning, limited slip differential, and radio. This car, I think, is a 3-option car. I don't think it originally came with a radio. The most valuable RS Americas generally have no sunroof. Those are what are most sought after. And then I guess color was an option. Polar silver and midnight blue metallic were optional because they cost extra. Guards red, white, or black were standard. And I believe there were 8 paint to sample RS Americas. I just might have a couple of those in my garage. So I happen to like those cars quite a bit. And again, turbos. Basic 2 variants for this car, 1991 and 1992. They made what is commonly called the 3.3 liter turbo. Porsche simply called it the 964 turbo, but we've called it 3.3 to distinguish it from the later 3.6. Of those 2 cars, both are great. The 3.6 is more sought after because it's more rare, and it's a better but slightly better car. So if you have a 3.3 turbo, feel no shame. It's a spectacular car. If anything, I think the thing that people get most excited about the 3.6 turbo is these wheels. These wheels are made by a company called Speedline, and they are literally almost like jewelry. I mean, they're just fun to look at. And kind of an unusual time, Porsche generally didn't let another company put their name in front of theirs. I can't actually think of another example, but if you look closely at these wheels, they're actually etched into the wheel. It says Speedline for Porsche. And they're just sort of a signature design element for the car. They're also the first of the 964s to get the red brake calipers. So you sort of couple the Speedline for Porsche wheels and the red brake calipers, and you sort of just get automotive art. In terms of drivability, these cars essentially used, or the 3.3, used essentially a carryover motor for the 930 with a few improvements. So in terms of day-to-day use, I actually prefer the normally aspirated cars. They perform more like a 911 I'm used to. But these cars, what I like about the turbo is they're the last of the traditional hairy single turbo, rear-wheel drive, lots of lag. So if you think of that experience that we've all thought about since the 70s when the original 911 turbo came out, this car delivers it in a really visceral fashion, yet it has the updated suspension and brakes of a 964. So the way it performs at the limit is much more in control than, for example, even a late 930 would be. Then with the 3.6 liter, they actually base it on the normally aspirated 3.6 liter motor. And so they have quite a bit more torque than the 3.3 liter. They're just a beautiful car. The only problem with these cars is they become exorbitantly expensive. All 964s have, but these have become almost unobtainium for mere mortals like myself. So I would love to have one of these cars. Let's do this. Now we've talked a lot about the cars. Let's dive into, if we're looking at a 964, some of the key differences, some of the things that we're going to look at. So let's walk around this sample car. Again, this is a 94, but a lot of these things are going to apply for all of these cars. So first off, let's talk about paint. This is a hotly debated topic, and I'm going to go on record here and have a controversial opinion. And you can agree with me or not, but I've looked at enough of these cars. So here's my view. Right now we have this obsession with original paint, which I appreciate. I love original paint. I collect original paint cars. But we make 2 sort of fallacious errors that bother me. First off, we also want perfection. So we have this weird standard. We want a car with all original paint, but we expect no flaw. Well, how do you have a car that's 30 years old that's been used with no flaw, right? So if you want original paint, you have to be willing to accept some element of flaw in it. These cars really preceded the use of clear film. So unless you find the very rare car with almost 0 miles, you're going to find some flaw in almost any car no matter what. So that's one thing. The other thing is that with the advent of the use of the paint meter, we like to think that we can put a paint meter on these cars and they're going to meter perfectly and they're going to prove to us that they're all original paint. I caution you on that. So, and here's why. If you get a car like this particular car I metered earlier today, it meters very, very consistently. And a 964, if it meters as you would expect or hope it to, would meter between a low of about 3.5 mils to a high of maybe 5.5 or 6 mils with very little variance across the car. That would be an ideal situation. The question I always posit to people though, however, is let's say you're Porsche, money's tight, right? You're building these cars. They're still not completely hand-built, but there's a lot of labor involved in them. They were still painted by human beings. You had a high concern for paint quality. And let's say your quality control person looked at this car and thought, this spot looks a little bit dry on the fender. Logically, what do we think they did with that car? Did we think they wadded that car up and threw it away? Or do you think they made a notation, scuffed the panel, and sent it back to paint? So that's the only question I have for you, because what I find oftentimes is people will say, well, that hood meter is 4 and this meter is 7, so therefore it had to have been painted after the fact. What I tell people is it very well could have been painted after the fact, but it also could have been painted at the factory. So what I do, and what I've been doing for many years before we had paint meters, is I use what I call the hallmarks of original paint. That in conjunction with a paint meter reading to make a determination as to what I believe. Most people will never be able to definitively prove one way or the other, so you have to have a belief in something. So what I call hallmarks of original paint on a 964 would be the following. Orange peel, meaning that the paint does not lay out perfectly smooth. It's more like a surface of an orange. So what I want to see on one of these cars is I want to see good, consistent orange peel. That's indicative of factory. I look for color match. So if I have good, consistent orange peel, good, consistent color match. I want to look for evidence of flaw in the paint. So the factory paint process had some flaws, but very few. So if I see significant flaw, that's usually indication that it's been repaired. But if I see just little micro flaws, that could be indicative of original paint. And then I'm looking for evidence of paintwork. Evidence of paintwork would be backmasking lines. This is when they stop painting a panel, they put a piece of tape on to stop the paint, and when it dries, they peel this back, and that always leaves a line. So I'm running my fingers and I'm looking, I'm getting my LED flashlight, I'm looking for those things, right? Those are all the things that I'm looking at before I decide I think it's had paint work, or I'm comfortable saying I believe it to be original paint. So a little bit off topic, but it's a sore subject for me because people think it's so exact. But if you apply some logic to it, you recognize that it's not as simple as we make it sound. It's much easier with modern cars that are painted robotically than when they were actually painted by human beings. A couple other things with 964s. They are prone to corrosion at the base of the windscreen. More so in the front windscreen than the rear, but it does still affect these both front and rear. So if you're going to go look at one, inspect for that. One of the best things I like to see in a 964 is I like to see its original windshield. So you can see the marking here indicating this is an original windshield. One other clue, it's an original windshield. If someone didn't, they came from the factory, the little sticker on the inside giving a little warning. And if that's present, I've never seen an aftermarket windshield have that. And the reason I like to see an original windshield, even if it has some flaw in it, is it means no one's ever pulled this windshield out. I think the corrosion happens primarily because when someone removes the windshield, oftentimes they scratch in the channel. When moisture gets in here, corrosion can form, okay? So common issue here. Other common issues with 964s, they have H5 headlights. These like to cloud up on the inside. There are some resources you can look online on how to clean them. The basic method is you remove the headlight assembly and you take like a wooden dowel and some isopropyl alcohol and window cleaner and you manually clean on the inside of the lens. Be careful not to break. There's a little reflector tang in there that'll break if you're too aggressive, but you can clean these up pretty well. One of the other things that affects 964s is what we commonly call the frown. This bumper, usually what will happen is someone will come in too hot into a curb. This will get pressed upward, and this will make a frown. And so when you look back, if you see photos of a 964 and it looks like it's frowning at you, that's because it's had some sort of front impact, which really ruins the aesthetics. You can check online. There's a couple quick and easy ways to fix that. It's one of the best hours of your life you'll spend remedying that because it's particularly egregiously ugly. A couple other things. 964s like to shrink up the gasket that runs along the rocker here. It's a little bit of a bear to replace, but visually it's nice. So your gasket should continue all the way here, but there is a break from the factory here, and this will shrink up, and so oftentimes this gasket just goes missing. I have to give Porsche Classic a shout out. For many years, these reflectors for 964s were not available, and Porsche actually re-released them not too long ago. And what happens on these cars is they actually pink out, I call it. In fact, let's walk over to this Cabriolet because this will give you a good example of what they typically look like. Very, very typical that they turn this pink color, and you can see how they start cracking. This is very, very typical of what you'll find. Not a cheap repair. I think the set from Porsche Classic, all three of them, is around $1,200, but it's a really nice update that you can do on the car. I don't actually see it on any of these cars here, which surprises me, but I will point out the spoilers like to crack either here, you'll see a split here in the center, or here, and this is just the stress from the drive opening and closing. What's interesting is they split so consistently that many people have argued with me they come from the factory that way, but they actually don't because this is evidence. None of these cars have that split there. When you're inspecting one of these cars, put the rear spoiler up. There's a spoiler curtain inside there, so make sure it's not torn when you put that up. If you put it up and you can see daylight through it, it needs to be remedied. So just some basic stuff on these cars that are kind of unique to 964s. Let's open up the inside of this car and talk about what's going on the interior. As you know, I recently did a video on the check strap, very similar to a 993. When you open a door on a 964, do make sure the check strap is quiet. One thing I really, really like about 964s is the interior build quality. I would argue is probably the highest of any generation air-cooled 911. In fact, one of the issues Porsche was having at the time is they were just too expensive to build. They made them too complex. The quality was actually too high, believe it or not. And so with the 993, they actually enlisted the help of Toyota Consulting to come in and help them figure out how to make them a little bit more budget friendly. So interiors on 964s actually wear pretty well. I wouldn't say there's any normal egregious issues. Your typical things, the door check straps, open up the door pockets. They like to crack on the inside. And this is just really from people leaning on them. This is a rare car. These are not cracked. There's a repair kit you can buy online for those. Those like to crack. This door gasket likes to get split here because people drag their feet over it. The other thing that's unique to 964s is the gauges. Historically on air-cooled 911s, because the gauges are open on the back side of the trunk, what happens if you drive one of these cars, one of the earlier cars in a damp climate like Seattle, the gauges had a habit of fogging up. It was just normal. You had a warm cabin on one side and cool air coming in from the outside on the back side. And so in the 964, they actually used a double pane glass. But sometimes that double pane glass, the seal will fail, much like it would at your home windows. And so if you ever look at one, put a light on them, and sometimes they'll have a cracking effect to them. And also sometimes the inside of the gauges themselves will peel up. Sort of unique. A couple other things worth noting. 964s didn't come with a large variety of radios. The early cars generally came with the Blaupunkt Stuttgart. We'll walk over to that Targa and I'll show you that in a moment. But the later radio starting in 1992 is the Porsche CR1, which, believe it or not, is made by Alpine. It's a Japanese radio. They commonly fail and they're very hard to repair. So they sound terrible as well. So it's sort of the trifecta of bad, but it is technically correct. But again, interiors on these cars really quite good. One other thing I always tell people to inspect for is they come from the factory, the carpets, and this is the same on 993s as well. The factory carpet isn't actually tacked down. So oftentimes when people put a new floor mat in, they think this is the old floor mat and they throw it away. So just make sure when you inspect one that you actually have all 4 of the floor mats. If you have a black car, you're lucky. They're still available from Porsche. Around $1,000 will get you all 4. But if you have a different color interior, you're likely out of luck, particularly if you have a Matador red or one of the more unusual colors. This particular car is just a standard leather car. Let's walk over the Targa. I'm going to show you a little bit of a different configuration for that. So on the Targa, much like if you watch my 3.2 Carrera video, this car has leather belt line. And just like on a 3.2 Carrera, the way you can tell that is if you look at the door handles, they'll have a stitched door handle, which is kind of a nice feature. And on 964s, what they actually get is a fully stitched console and a stitched lower dash as well. So now if you have an early 964, you can hold your head up proud. This is one of the few moments that makes you unique from the later ones. They actually dropped this option starting in 1992. So only the 90 and 91 cars will have the leather belt line option. Starting in 1992, you had to specify either the standard leather or pay for full leather, which would have then gotten you the full leather dash. So oddly enough, for example, if you have a 91 964 Turbo, even though they got leather belt line standard, they didn't get full leather. They still have this plastic dash cap like the standard cars would have. So something that's kind of unique. This car does have one kind of cool option, which is the onboard computer. Kind of fun. You'll see the display here. It shows distance to empty, average speed. The most important display it has in my book is it has actual speed, which is kind of nice because speedos in these cars are always hard to read. One interesting fact about a 964 is you can actually swap an onboard computer tach into any 964 and it's plug and play. So kind of a cool update. You can steal a tach, for example, out of a Tiptronic car because the Tiptronic, they were standard equipment and they plug right in. If you try that on a 993, they will not plug and play. You cannot have it to OBC without doing a lot of work. So kind of a fun upgrade. I've done them on a lot of my 964s. You can see this is the Stuttgart radio. This would have been the standard radio in 90 and 91. The 89.5 cars carried over the Blaupunkt Reno, which is the radio that originally came in the 89 3.2 Carrera. A couple other little just silly minor differences. Early cars in the back seat have the rear seat releases this style. The later cars starting in 1992, the release is up top like they are on a 993. Just for fun, let's open some engine compartments and talk about some differences. Again, the thing to know about 964s is the basic architecture of the engine stayed the same throughout production, but Porsche instituted several hundred engineering changes over the course of production, frankly, none of which are life-changing, but again, the later, generally the slightly more developed they're going to be. So a couple things notable. They did an update kit, which is this vent hose here, which ventilates the distributor. What they found is that ozone would build up in the distributor. You've got 2 distributors on a 964, and that would degrade the rubber belt, which drove the distributor. If that breaks, the car still runs, but you run an issue of potential detonation and could damage the engine. So Porsche issued an update. This car has it. I rarely see a car that doesn't have it, but if you wonder what this looks like surgical tubing is, it's a vent kit to ventilate the distributor. So that's sort of an important update. A couple other notable things about 964s. Like all of them, the engine sound pads like to fail. This is a nice car. It's a 17,000 mile car, so it's in really great shape. I would suggest if you ever drop the motor for any reason, replace the sound pad. I'll give a shout out to a friend of mine who makes a product called the Sound Pad Keeper if you just want to visually clean that up. David Etter makes a product called the Sound Pad Keeper, and it just puts a nice edge on that. Kind of a nice little update. You know, we're going to do a little bit later, we're going to put one of these cars up on the lift, and I'm going to show you some of the things to be looking underneath, so we'll focus more on that kind of stuff there. But really what you're looking for, the 964, I want to see a car that's got a history of being cared for. One of the problems when cars become inexpensive is that people stop caring for them in the same way. So back in 2010, when a 964 was $15,000 or $20,000, the level of care people gave it was very different than now that it's a $60,000, $70,000, $80,000, $90,000 car, right? And so what I want to know is, was it owned by someone who, during that entire ownership, loved and prized and took care of that car? That's going to be one of the single most important things on a 964, because they are expensive to work on, and a good one is really, really good, and a bad one, not so much. Let's pop the front trunk here. I love that sound. Okay, so front trunk on a 964. A couple things that I want to see. Everyone wants to see the option code sticker. This option code sticker tells you the VIN number, right? It tells you the color code. So the color code L92M, Polar Silver Metallic. UN would be partial leather black supple. And then the other codes you can decode online, but for example, CO2 means it was sold in the US outside of California. XD4 means it had Porsche colored crests, and so on and so forth, 220 limited slip. So you can decode what options the car came with if, for example, you do not have a window sticker. I would trust this as Disciple more so than, for example, a certificate of authenticity with Porsche. The other thing I'll tell you when you're inspecting the trunk on a 964, always take the time to pull the trunk carpet out. A lot of people don't do that. What they'll do on an inspection is they'll just simply flip it up and kind of do a general perusal. That's not a good idea. Unfortunately, I don't have my screwdriver with me, but what you want to do is you just turn these half a turn, this piece pulls out, and this trunk carpet comes completely out. And what you're going to want to look in here for is evidence of damage or repair. So when we put this car up on the lift here shortly, I'll have the trunk carpet out, and we'll delve into what you're going to look for there. While we're talking about the trunk, let's talk about trunk accessories and what comes with one of these cars. Oh, I almost forgot one thing, but we're going to jump to it because it's important. You'll see a VIN tag here. If you watch my 3.2 Carrera video, you'll notice from 87 to 89, they had VIN tags on the panels. Funny enough, these came back for 1994, well, 1993 production, but 1994 model year. And so one way to tell that this car has all its original panels is you'll have a VIN tag on the hood, front fenders, doors, engine lid, and bumper covers and quarter panel. So like this car, I can verify all those panels are original because they have a factory tag, as well as the engine and transmission. And that was required due to federal law. They were trying to reduce auto theft. So if you close the trunk on one of these cars, please do not shut it on the crest. That is the wrong way to do it. It's unsupported, puts too much force on there. So let's jump over. I'm going to show you what one of these cars would have come with when they were delivered new. So come on into the hangout space, and we're going to show you some fun 964 stuff. So let's talk about what would have come with a 964 if it was delivered new. So let's start with the glove box items. So throughout all of production, they came with this style pouch. This is what that would have looked like, kind of a black vinyl pouch. The early cars changed in late 91, early 92. They had the bound style red and silver books, and these are the things they would have come with, right? One thing I don't have here to display, they would have had a separate Blaupunkt Stuttgart manual for that. The later cars, very similar, but they went to a more of a bound silver like this, and then the maintenance book was a standalone. Worth knowing, in the maintenance book should have a second copy of that option code sticker, which is under the hood. So you should be looking for that. That verifies that as the original book with the car. In terms of keys, they got 2 master keys, they got 2 wheel lock keys, and then they got a spare wheel lock key, and then that's a valet key. And then they would have gotten a key code, which would have had the codes for how to make the new keys for your car. So those items all would have come in the glove box. Let's talk about in the front trunk what they would have come with. You'll notice I've got 2 different toolkits here. The toolkits changed slightly over the years, and there's a lot of fighting about what's included there. This is pretty definitive. This is the early style kit. The early style kit uses a snap bag, and it has more tools than the later kit. So this is an appropriate kit from 89.5 through 91, and you can kind of see what was included in said kit. And then the later kit has a string tie, And it's a fairly complete kit, but has less items than the earlier one. You lose, for example, the tool for adjusting the fan belts and a few other small items. So again, this would be the late 92 to 94 style kit. This is the early style kit. They would have come with a plastic bag for the tire to be in, as well as the OFX gloves. Keep your hands nice and clean. The jack style changed in 1993, so the earlier cars through 93 used this style jack with the separate jack handle. So it's a two-piece. And then the later cars got this, actually has a 928 part number jack, and it actually has a bag that it goes in. And then the last piece is the air compressor. This would have varied if you had a European delivery car, but if it was a US delivered car, it would have had this black compressor. These tabs always like to break off, so most of the time you see them, they won't have tabs on them. But this is what the compressor looks like. So if you're wondering what your car would have been delivered with, these are many of the items. So a lot of people ask me, they say, okay, well, if I want to know all this stuff, if I want to be a nerd like you, well, no one wants to be a nerd like me, but I've been collecting Porsche literature for a better part of 30 years because I like knowing the information. So I'm going to show you a couple tools that are probably useful if you can track them down. The first one is a book written by a guy named Adrian Streether. It's called the Porsche 911 Enthusiast Companion. It's a pretty good book. I'm going to give Adrian a shout out here. You know, subsequently, we've learned a few items in here aren't 100% correct, but he did a pretty knock-up job, so I'm a big fan of this book. Pick it up. It's available on Amazon and all your typical places. It's a very good resource. A couple of things I really like. You can pick these up. You can find these on eBay or whatever. These are a salesman's pocket guide from period, so they're by year, so I have them by all the years. And they're called a fact book, and they have things like all the list prices, you know, back in the day. They list all the changes that happened, you know, all the optional equipment, specifications, and so on. And these are a pretty good tool. One of my favorite things to have is Porsche would print these service technic updates each year, and you can find these, and these will spell out changes. So when people want to argue and they'll say, well, when did Porsche, you know, make this change, or they didn't make that change, it'll be listed. So here's a perfect example. Starting in 1991, they got a check engine light. They didn't have them in 89.5 or 90, so they have a check engine light. This spells out what the new system is and how you diagnose using it. So all the changes, those hundreds of little engineering changes that Porsche went to, they're in here. So for example, they talk about they changed to a plastic intake system. The earlier cars have an aluminum system. They saved about 15 kilograms, I think, with this update. So just silly stuff, or actually 1.2 kilograms, to take that back. 15 would be huge. But a good resource if you want to know what changes happen. The other thing is, if you're really lucky, you can find books like this. This is would have been a dealer item. You know, it's a parts manual from 1992. And it had all the information from Porsche for a dealer for how to order a car, what the exclusive options were. And you can see, you know, all the codes. So a lot of people say, well, how do you know what interior code my car was, or what option code that was, or a particular package? You know, what was included in the P03 package? Only if you have this kind of information can you decode that. So all that kind of stuff. So that's a very cool tool if you can find one of those. Of course, all the various brochures, you know, so you can see in period what the brochures would have looked like. One of my favorite ones, though, I have to say, is the Porsche exclusive brochure. I'm going to show you this. This is kind of fun. Again, if you're a nerd like me, it shows you all the stuff you could have ordered from Porsche exclusive. So you can see, you know, the wild center console, the wood trim. Of course, he's putting a Tiptronic wooden shift handle on there. Even has the built-in phone. But yeah, kind of a fun thing to have, and it shows, you know, what all the option costs were, what the codes were, and that sort of thing. So again, a lot of times if you want to have the information, one of the reasons I like to make these videos is that so many people will go on one of these forums and they'll take information that they've heard from someone who heard from someone else that thinks that they have the information. And it's better not just to assume you have the information, but have an actual source and say, you know, this comes from Porsche's publication in 1991. So I've really, really enjoyed showing you this information. And let's jump to going underneath the car and show you what you want to check out. Welcome back. We put this 964 up on the lift, and I want to just do a quick walk around what we're going to be looking for when we're inspecting a 964. Now, my one caveat, this is not a full PPI video. this is sort of, hey, if you have the opportunity to look underneath the 964, what are some basic things you want to look at to see if this is a car that you should immediately roll out or potentially take for a pre-purchase inspection. For the record, I'm a big fan of pre-purchase inspections. Believe it or not, even in my own shop, I inspect my cars and then I generally run it past another Porsche guy just because I want another set of eyes. Sometimes you look at a car a bunch of times and you'll miss something really obvious. So let's start at the back end of the 964. 964s do have a lower engine cover. This has been removed so we can do this video. There's a lot of debate about the engine cover. A lot of people think it traps in engine heat. The Porsche engineers designed it. I'm a fan of the engine cover. I know that's a controversial opinion. You can form your own. So a couple things. 964s have a reputation as being leakers. I don't necessarily share that same opinion. I don't believe that they're any leakier than any other 3.6 liter, for example, the 993s, and certainly not leakier than earlier 911 motors. However, compared to, for example, a 3 liter or a 3.2, they tend to have more leaks. So let's start with the most important leaks I want to be looking for in a 964. And first things I want to be looking for are case leaks. So when I want to make sure we're not leaking through the case through O-ring bolts, this car is really dry. This kind of brown nasty stuff you see on here is actually cosmoline. It was applied by the factory as a protective measure. So even though it looks unattractive, it's actually correct. So I actually like seeing the cosmoline on here. It tells me the engine's never been apart and it's original. But sometimes in photos, people will think this is evidence of oil leak. This is not oil leak. And this material actually kind of sweats off as the engine heats up. So I want to make sure the engine case itself is dry. I want to make sure the cylinder heads and base gaskets are dry. So I'm going to be inspecting up in here. And again, I can see this is nice and dry and original with all the cosmoline. I can tell you, for example, the push rod tubes have never been replaced on this car, which is my preferred design or style, if you will. 964s also like to leak at the timing chain covers. You'll capture it here, left and right. So I want to be looking in these locations. I'm also generally going to be inspecting the heat exchangers on the surfaces and sides, because generally when they leak, it'll bake onto the heat exchangers, and so they'll get stained. And so if you look at a heat exchanger on a really leaky car over time, even if a less than honest seller's cleaned it off, you'll see evidence that the oil is sort of baked onto the heat exchangers themselves. They do like to leak at the valve cover gaskets. Not a huge deal. Those are not leaks I lose a lot of sleep over, but I want to make a note if they're leaking. This is in some ways a bad one to look at because it's so pristine. There really are no leaks of note on this car. I'm going to make sure it's not leaking at the rear main or any other leaks here. Transmissions on these tend not to be leaky, so I'm going to inspect those. You'll also find your transmission number here, which you can compare, for example, to the certificate of authenticity to verify that it's original. On this particular car, Porsche was kind enough to put a VIN tag, and I'll have to clean it off to show that, but that actually has the VIN for the car. And again, on the 94s, they'll have the VIN on the engine case itself as well. So it's sort of a secondary point of making sure this is the original engine and transmission. A couple other things I'm looking at. I want to look at exhausts on 964s. So the way the exhaust works on the car, essentially you have your heat exchangers / headers, we'll call them. They come back. They first go to the catalytic converter, which is here. I want to make sure the catalytic converter is in place, particularly if it's going to go to a state like California. I'm going to have my video guy come to the other side. You can actually get a better view of what the cat looks like. A lot of people will put a bypass pipe on here. This is the original cat. And just make sure it's present or you have it if you care about passing emissions. Then they go to a primary muffler, which is here, and come around to the secondary muffler. Very common in the aftermarket, people will replace either the primary muffler and do a bypass, or they'll do a secondary muffler bypass. Actually, I'm kind of a fan of the secondary muffler bypass. I like the sound. I'm less of a fan personally of the primary muffler bypass, but again, that's sort of a preference thing. Okay, let's jump to rear suspension, brakes, this sort of thing. Again, all this sort of what looks visually ugly is actually the original cosmoline. It sort of demarcates the car as original. I'm generally going to look at the CV joints, make sure they look good. The boots aren't spraying grease or split open. I'm going to make sure, looking up in here, inspecting in the CV joints again. And I'm going to check out both sides. I'm going to be looking for evidence of any kind of damage or repair, leaks, those kinds of things. The other things that I can do is now on the inside of the wheels, I can look for the part number, so you can actually see the part number on the wheel. This verifies it's a factory original wheel. It may be hard to capture on video, but if you're in person, you can kind of put your face in there and you can actually see the part number. So you can verify that as real. This is a limited slip car, so one of the other things I want to do on a limited slip car is I'm just going to rotate the wheels, and what you'll find out on a limited slip car is both wheels will turn the same direction. On a factory LSD car, if doing this, the wheels, the other one turns the opposite direction. It's an open differential car. So I know this to be a limited slip differential car. I'm also, when I'm in the back, I'm making sure that I don't have any damage underneath the rear bumper cover. Generally, this is where you'll pick up if the bumper cover's been refinished or damaged, because oftentimes they don't do a very good job on the bottom edge. This one's original. So again, I'm looking for this stuff. Excuse the fact there's no under tray, otherwise you wouldn't be able to see in this video, but it should be there. Then underneath on the pans, what I'm looking for on the pans is going to be any evidence that someone went to a tire store and they put a floor jack underneath it, they had an off-road expedition. I want to see it look like this. From the factory, these pans have a gray Schutz material, which is what this looks like, and they'll have a slight amount of overspray. So I've had some people say, oh, I think the car's been painted, there's overspray on the pan. That's actually evidence that it's likely original, and you'll see this more on the cars that have color. And the way you can tell it's original is they didn't mask the bottom of the cars off when they painted it. So when the paint sort of drifted down, you'll tend to get the color on the ridges. So for example, if it's yellow or red, you'll see a little bit of red ridge here. If the pans are completely body colored, then they've been refinished. But if you have just a little bit of fog, more so on this side, a little bit of the ridges and less so toward the center, that would actually be correct. So I'm looking at that. 964s like to leak at the oil lines running down. So I'm going to make sure I don't have any leaks from the oil lines. Generally what you'll find is it seeping out one of these covers. I want to make sure all my little fasteners are here and not broken. It's just sort of indicative that someone, was careful with the car. Moving to the front, what I'm going to be looking at is evidence of the leaky steering rack. You'll generally see it, sort of seeping coming off this cover. When I would do a full inspection, I'll pull this cover off. For the purpose of this video, we're just going to basically make sure I don't see any evidence of it. Generally, you'll see kind of seepy fluid leaking out the sides of the cover here if you have a rack that's leaking. Oftentimes the bottom tow hooks here will show impact damage or someone tying them down improperly. So I'm inspecting for those. And then as I move to the front of the car, what I'm looking at, same thing, I'm going to be looking at all my suspension, how do my bushings look, make sure they're not cracked, starting to fail, things like that. I'm looking for any evidence of any changes. I'm not opposed to aftermarket parts, but I want to know what's on the car, so I'm going to be inspecting for that. And then the other thing I'm looking for is on this front tub. The front tubs on 964s really like to take some impact, so they'll generally, they'll get sort of a banged up effect here. People pull too hard into a curb. In fact, 964s are famous for what we call the frown. So if our video guy wants to come around here, I'll show him that. Usually what will happen is when people impact the trunk, it'll force the bumper cover up, and this bumper cover will take sort of a nasty frown to it. So you can watch online how to repair that, but essentially what you do is you remove these lower covers and you pull down this edge and pull it down a little bit past level, and then you put it back together and it'll pull the bumper cover. This one's nice and crisp because you can tell it hasn't really had a significant impact. These are little drain tubes from the factory that basically keep water out of the trunk, and they oftentimes go missing. There's one missing on this car that I'll replace. And this just keeps water from coming in the trunk but allows the trunk to drain. One way you can tell these under trays are original, they'll have the cosmoline on them. So that's, again, I sort of fight as a Concours guy. It's kind of ugly, but it's actually correct. And then the trunk floor itself should be the body Schutz just like the floor plans. So it will have a little bit of overspray as well. This car being polar silver, you won't pick up on it, but if it was red, you would just get a little bit of a fog of a red in here. Again, it's overspray, it's not painted that way. Other things I want to be looking at, I want to look at the front oil cooler, make sure it's not leaking so I can look through this little cover here. The other thing you'll often find in here is they use kind of a foam that seals that to the body, and that usually breaks down. And about half the time you'll look in here and this is all stuffed with the factory foam. So if that's the case, what I want to do is I'll remove these covers, pull the cooler out, and I'll order a new seal from Porsche. It's fairly minor. A couple other things I always want to look at, looking wheels. I want to determine their factory, so we already looked and saw the part numbers. But one other way to tell is the factory wheels will have the wheel width as well as the offset cast next to the valve stem. So I'm looking for that. I'm inspecting for any damage on the inside or outside of the wheels, making sure that they run true. Oftentimes wheels have been very poorly restored, so I'm always checking that out. And then the other thing I always want to look at on tires is I want to look at date code. So the way you read a date code is federally mandated. It starts with the DOT. So you can see it starts with the DOT, and the last 4 digits indicate the week and year. So this tire was made the 9th week of 2016. So that tire is just over 6 years old. So it's right on the bubble in my world. I won't run a tire more than, I like them less than 5. For example, one manufacturer would be Michelin. They say 8 years is what Michelin says. So I definitely will not drive a car with tires more than 8 years old. And I particularly won't drive any kind of performance car with an old tire. They just drive better with new rubber. I won't get into a tire discussion because, of course, that's highly debatable. But also when I'm in the wheel wells here, I'm just going to check out any evidence of any repair. For example, if we look on the fender edge here, this is how they're finished out. So oftentimes if they've had any kind of body or collision repair, they will not have that finish. Now some people actually are surprised that that finish is so rough. Well, that's just how the factory did them. So oftentimes when they've been repaired, someone makes them smooth. And then even if you get a new fender from Porsche, they don't have the texturized on the edge, and so that commonly goes missing. So that's just a real quick overview of some of the things that we're going to look at underneath the 964. The thing with 964s is as the values were low for so long, a lot of them got so abused. So what you really want to do is you want to buy the best 964 that fits in your budget. That will save you a lot of money, time, and heartache. And be patient. There's a lot of bad cars on the market, but doing some basic quick due diligence. If it passes sort of your basic inspection, again, I do encourage a pre-purchase inspection. Thanks for watching.